I'm Brian, and this is Game Story Basics. Where do bad ideas come from? Part 2. Yes and. Yes and I'm gonna lose a lot of you with this one, because I'm here to say that bad ideas come from a process called yes and. And some of you are gonna go, Brian, what are you talking about? That's an amazing brainstorming process. And to that I say, sometimes, but a lot of times not so much. So for those who don't know, yes and is an improv technique where you don't deny what has come before, you try to build upon it. So if you're doing an improv and you've got this idea that we're on the bridge of a spaceship, and I come in and join the improv and I don't want to do a spaceship, I want to do a courtroom or a throne room of a castle and switch genre, I can't. Right? I can't just deny what you guys have done and just take control of the process and switch it over this way. I have to build upon what you've already done. And it's a great technique for improv. A lot of improv is about learning to influence and contribute without taking control, right? Like there's another improv exercise called Mirror Mirror, where two people mirror each other's motions. And after a while, like you do something and the other person does it, but when they do something, you do it. After a while, you start to feel this sense of control between you, in the middle, in the space between you. And so that's a really powerful improv technique. Some people have appropriated that for brainstorming, right? Because they think, it's so creative. It's like, wow, we just always build on what came before. But actually, this kind of sense of trying to only build on what has come before is not really the point of brainstorming, right? It's brainstorming. The idea is to come up with a lot of ideas, and a lot of times the most powerful moments in a brainstorm are where someone says something and that sparks an idea in someone else. On the surface, it doesn't look like they're building upon it. It's not like, oh, you said something about trains and now I have an idea involving trains, right? It's more like, you said something about trains and that made me think about spaceships, and now I've got this new idea. And there's this very free-form, flowing building that happens, but it's not obvious on the outside that it is building on that. But as someone who's spent 30 years off and on in brainstorming sessions, I can tell you it very much is building on what came before. The reason that yes and leads to bad ideas is because there are people with some level of power or influence who often have a desire, weirdly, they have a desire to control the process, despite all of the talk about don't take control. And the fact that someone who is in charge has a desire to control the creative process is usually a sign that their ideas are not that great. Like they're in charge, but somehow their ideas keep not ending up being the ones that are taken. And so unfortunately, and I know I sound cynical, I'm speaking from firsthand experience, unfortunately, they will do this thing where they're like, well, it's really fulfilling and wholesome, we'll do yes and we won't deny other people's ideas, we'll just build on what's there, and so let me start, here's my idea, right? And then now, of course, they've put everybody in the room in a little box, because you have to build on their idea. You cannot seem to be, overtly switching, but you could, if you weren't trapped in this yes and hell cycle, you actually could say, oh, that's a really interesting idea, and that sparks something else, and go wherever. It can work in directed brainstorming. In other words, we have a very specific problem we need to solve, and down at the micro level of storytelling, and how do we solve that? In that scenario, I think yes and can be useful, right? Because you're already like, okay, look, our heroes are stuck on this cliff and the bridge is out and the enemies are coming and there's 15 conditions, and within that framework we have to come up with something cool. But anything wider, any lens wider than that, it just becomes an attempt for someone who doesn't think that their idea could survive the free market of ideas that is a real raw brainstorming session. I said earlier that there are very few ideas that are inherently good or bad. So that's why we came up with criteria to establish what we mean by the word bad. As I mentioned then, there are occasionally ideas that are just bad. They're just not entertaining, they're not fun, they're not funny. This is, we're down in the depths now of the really dark part of the ocean where the light never shines in terms of dealing with ideas, because if someone on your team, especially someone in power, just has a bad instinct and they're really excited about this idea and it is just actively a bad idea, and maybe you can't even come up with objective criteria for why it's bad, but your job is dealing in ideas. That's the basic currency of your job every day, and you've learned to tell the good from the bad, and it's a bad idea. That's a really bad place to be, and it's kind of hard to define. I guess I would say at a bare minimum, it's just not entertaining, it's not interesting, it's boring. It breaks immersion, makes people pull out of the experience and go, well, that's stupid. That's a really tough situation to be in. We'll talk about some strategies later, but just be aware that it's a tiny percentage of ideas, but that does exist. That's all for now. I'll see you on the next one.